Hello. Now we continue sidelines of Sicilian. I mean the sidelines already with a knight on f3 when white doesn't want to play d4, and today we are going to talk about knight f3 d6. So that is for players, for instance, who are playing dragon or Najdorf. They have to start with d6. There is no other way to get then your main Sicilian. Also, pretty often d6 is a move which rouser players are choosing. So people who play knight f6, knight c6 system. So after d6, white has, as usual, a big choice of sidelines, but I would say that only bishop b5 check, which is the most popular after d4 in this position nowadays, might cause some small troubles. I mean, at least black, I think black is doing fine there, but white is fighting for some small opening advantage. In my opinion, in all other sidelines, all other moves are quite harmless, and black is fine most of the time in more than one way, but anyway you need to know it. And again, having maybe you will find something to your taste with white color after all other moves than d4, bishop b5 check. So let's start with the craziest one, which is b4. Well, it is definitely better than the second b4, that is for sure, but still not good enough to get an advantage. Not 100% sure enough to equalize even, but okay, at least it's romantic. So d4, knight f6, bishop d3, and of course black can just play g6, and white usually castles, at some point plays a3 and trying to get some compensation for the pawn because of the center. Well, definitely it's not really compensation more than for equality, but still there is some play. Anyways, g6, in any case, it's perfectly playable for black, but I actually think that e5 is a very straightforward and very unpleasant for white, because now he really has to prove his compensation. Castles, let's say ed4, very simple play, knight takes d4. Now bishop e7 is even maybe more principal, really trying to play for advantage. But knight c6 is good enough, and okay, white's best is probably to play queen e1, and well, at least black can simply play bishop e7 castle with a perfectly good position, equal position. So b4 is not too serious, frankly. I don't think it's a move I can advise you to play, because it's not even clear what are you hoping for after b4. Maximum you can get is barely enough compensation for the pawn, but no more than that. So then b3, as I mentioned already, then it's better to play second b3 already, because here simply knight is already on f3, and you cannot get f4. So let's say black is playing like this, and after bishop b2 he can always play e5, just blocking this bishop. And since, if you remember, with a knight on g1, white had a plan playing bishop c4, knight g2 and f4 to activate this bishop. Now he doesn't have this option, and he's not really fighting for advantage. So b3 here is also not recommendable. Then another possible move is g3. Okay, it's quite harmless also, but again, playable. Knight f6, knight c3. Well, I guess e5 is perfectly possible here. Quite normal move, but I believe it's better to play g6, simply bishop g2, bishop g7, moving into the dragon. But as I've mentioned already, that this dragon with g3 is pretty harmless for black. Castles, knight c6. And black has no problem whatsoever in this position. Let's say in case of knight takes e6 and e5, well, white gets a better pawn structure, but black is extremely active and wants to play bishop f5, and it's only black who can fight for advantage here. If white is playing knight b3, then bishop g4 is very unpleasant, f3, bishop e6. Bishop d7 is also possible, but bishop e6, knight d5, and now b5 starting to play on the queen side, a5, followed by a5. Black is slightly better already here. So the main theoretical move, because you cannot really play bishop e3 now because of knight g4, yeah, you also have a problem. So knight d2 is what usually played in this position. Now a very good plan is rook b8. I myself played it once against Vasily Ivanchuk in Horgen 1995, and pretty soon I was slightly better already. a4, a6, so black just playing b5, and it's difficult to stop it. Knight d5, b5, ab, ab. Now, well, I think Vasily played bishop e3 against me, and actually finally couldn't equalize. I think the main move is bishop g5, but still knight g4 now is strong. c3, h6, let's say bishop d2, knight g5, knight is heading to c4. Black can always play e6 in this position, so absolutely no problem for black. So g3 is is quite harmless as well. Then another move I played myself once is bishop c4. It was favorite move of Mickey Adams in the 90s. He played quite many games like this, but yeah, it's well, just to play, yeah, just to avoid Najdorf, I guess, by all means, but objectively it's not giving anything to white. Knight f6, it gives a game, yeah, white has a game, no more than that. d3, knight c6, let's say castles, and now both setups are fine. I think e6 is perfectly okay, so the game develops like this, more or less. c3, bishop e7, bishop b3, otherwise black will play d5 sooner or later. So now black can just push his pawns b5, rook e1, castle. Okay, white manages to get the center d4, but not an advantage, yeah, because after bishop b7, black has very flexible structure in the center. Is actually better developed. And let's say h3, useful move, a5. It's a complicated position, but well, double-edged, equal complicated position, no more than that for white. But even more popular is g6 here. And then the game would continue in the similar fashion. c3, bishop g7, rook e1, castles, let's say bishop b3. And again, black is doing what he's usually doing in such situations, is pushing his pawns, let's say b5, h3 to stop bishop g4, a5, for example, d4, a4, bishop c2, knight d7. Okay, of course it's not forced line, but just showing how logically the game can develop. And here black has a good play. I believe he has quite some initiative on the queen side. White got his center, but it still needs to finish development, and black can start to push b4, e3 under some circumstances, having pressure on the center. So I believe black is perfectly fine here. So those moves are leading to equal position, complicated position like g3, bishop c4, but really not pretending for any opening advantage. So I would rather prefer than to play c3 on move 3, even though again it's also not too dangerous, but at least it's more logical. Yeah, white wants to play d4. Again, black has, in my opinion, more than one way to be fine after c3. Knight f6 is most logical move, actually trying to stop d4, because, well, as you hopefully notice, knight takes e4 is not threatening because of queen a4 check and queen takes e4. But of course, after d4, black can already take this pawn. So that is the idea. Knight f6 in such a way is stopping d4 move. The different setups now for white. Mainly white plays bishop e2 here. What else? h3, then already knight c6 works. And let's say after, if bishop d3, that will transpose to force bishop d3 move, which we will just in a second consider. If queen c2, white wants to play d4, but even e5, I think now it's fine. Looks like a very good Ruy Lopez for black, because queen on c2 is not doing much. And yeah, the d5 square is not really weak because knight cannot get there because of the pawn on c3. So black is perfectly fine in this position. Another option is to play bishop d3, let's say knight c6, and now h3 or bishop c2. Maybe bishop c2 can be checked a bit more because most of the time white is playing h3, but bishop c2 is possible. Again, I'm not sure white has anything really after e5, but normally black plays bishop g4. Now h3, so white really wants to push d4, otherwise he will probably have nothing simply in this position. And now bishop h5 is very principal move, leading to quite unclear position, but if you want to play it more, I would say, safe or simple, you can take on f3. In this position, it's pretty okay. Queen takes f3, g6, because it's not so easy for white to get d4. Because, for instance, after queen d1, black has this interesting maneuver, bishop h6, actually stopping d4, because then you can take on c1 and take on d4. And according to engines, again, black is doing perfectly fine. But bishop h5 is more principal than d4 is the idea. Takes, and now black has several ways to play. Well, maybe bishop takes f3, gf3, well, sad necessity, because otherwise the pawn on d4 was hanging. And now e5 leads to a very double-edged, complicated position. Let's say bishop a4, knight d7, which computer assesses as approximately equal, but very sharp and unclear, in my opinion. That's why usually, well, more often maybe white is playing h3, just start trying to stop bishop g4. But in this case, well, there is a move d5, which leads to a very complicated position, e5, knight d7, and very unclear position. Perfectly okay for black, I believe. But maybe simpler is just to play e5 here, or first g6, then e5. Now, for example, just one funny, not necessary, but a funny line. If castle, computer actually quite like g5 move. Starting a direct attack, bishop e2, g4, hg, bishop takes g4. Let's say d4, rook g8, d5, knight e7 is a very unclear, complicated position, but white can really get under attack easily in this situation. But of course, g5 was not necessary. But that's why if I was white, I would rather play bishop c2 first, just to avoid this possibility. And now I guess black has different ways of getting a decent position. d5 is very principal, very unclear. For example, something like that. Of course, the e5 pawn is a bit weak, but probably it's still okay for black. I think the simplest really is to play g6, because white has nothing better than playing d4, and then here it takes everything, bishop g7, and actually white cannot really stop d5. After both sides castles, black rather quickly pushes d5 and equalizes here. So all in all, bishop d3 is not too dangerous, obviously. Then that's why bishop e2 mainly is played. But also, yeah, it's the idea is that now knight c6 is not good, because already now d4 can be dangerous. cd, knight takes e4, d5. Knight cannot really retreat from c6 because of queen a4 check and losing the knight on e4. So black has to play queen a5 check. But here after knight c3, yeah, the difference is that the bishop is on e2. So after taking on c3 and knight e5, white just castles. Is in time to castle, and this position is extremely dangerous for black. White has a very powerful initiative for the pawn, so knight c6 is not recommended to play here. I think I myself played bishop d7, and many other strong players played like this. I think white is usually playing queen c2, trying to go d4, and black tries to stop white from this, playing queen c7. Perfectly playable for black, of course, but in my opinion, g6 move after bishop e2 is even simpler. It's much more logical just to play g6, because white still cannot get d4. So he castles, bishop g7, and now maybe the only chance for white is a very strange move, bishop b5 check, losing a tempi, but at least like this, he is managing d4, because after, if he plays rook e1, castles bishop f1, Then whether you can even play e5 straight away, but also knight c6 with the idea h3 e5, and it's, yeah, I mean, you have no problem at all. And in case of d4, black is also doing very well, attacking the center very quickly by playing bishop g4, and let's say d5, knight e5, knight bd2. Now many good moves, queen a5 to me looks most logical, and why black is at least equal here. So this is really harmless. That's why bishop b5 is a kind of try. Was quite popular at some point at the end of 90s, was played by Adams, Anand, but frankly not too dangerous also. So now I can offer you two different options. One is more, I would say, complicated, maybe trying to play for a win. Another is solid and rather safe. Maybe knight bd7 is not the best move here, because after rook e1, a6, bishop f1, white manages d4, and even if it's, of course, still perfectly playable for black, but maybe there is a chance for white to get some small advantage. But if you want to play sharp, then knight c6 is a move. Was played in the game, if I remember correctly, Anand Gelfand from Groningen World Championship FIDE tournament, 1998, I think, or 9, don't remember already. But Anand won the game, but the position is very unclear. d4 castles, d5. Now, well, you can play knight a5 first, rook e1, e6, let's say bishop f1, rook e8. Very strange position with this knight. Of course, knight on a5 is out of play, but you cannot really take this knight yet. But black has, well, some advantage in development, and in general I think is doing quite fine, even though the position is pretty complicated. Computers nowadays actually recommend playing a6 first, bishop d3, knight a5. And again, in case of a4 there is e6, so black of course has to hurry. I mean, with this knight on a5 has to try to break through in the center. But yeah, it seems that he is in time. For example, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, one of the possible options, b5, knight bd2, e6. Well, very complicated position, quite unclear, according to computer, pretty equal and unclear. So knight c6 is, to me, is perfectly playable if you want a sharper game, but if you want a solid position, then bishop d7 is, I can recommend also. Bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, rook e1 or queen e2. I think you would probably do the same, knight e5 or rook e1, and now probably knight e5 is simplest, because I guess taking on e5, d5 shouldn't really give white anything. So knight e5, finally white at least manages to get d4 in this position, but you take on f3, play knight d7, rook d1, I guess black castles. Well, white has a center, but already lots of pieces exchanged, and even if he has some plus, it's really nominal. I think black is very close to completely equalize, or maybe actually already completely equalized. So those were the moves when white is not trying to play d4. Couple of other sidelines with d4 before we move to bishop b5 check. So let's say knight c3. I played once like this against Nakamura, I think in Stavanger 2017 maybe. The idea was after knight f6, well, first of all, there is a move e5, but really harmless. Yeah, nobody plays it like this anymore because takes, and now a6. This move is the most precise, just to avoid all kind of checks on b5, and then, well, white really gets completely nothing in this position. Only thing you have to watch out after bishop c4 not to get mated in one. But after a precise reaction e6, it's only black who can try to get some maybe small plus. He wants to play b5, and after a4, for instance, queen c7, kicking this knight, and let's say here, for example, black is already slightly better. So usually white is playing bishop e2, but because white cannot really get d4, so it's pretty harmless. Yeah, knight on e5 is active, but it's basically the only active piece in white's position. So black is perfectly okay after e6, but queen c7 maybe is even more precise, because now let's say d4, e6, bishop f4, bishop d6, bishop g3, knight bd7. I saw recently a game like this. Somebody played it with white, some strong grandmaster. Now knight g4. This is all the first line of engine. And well, finally we can conclude that white managed to equalize probably in this position, but he has no shade of advantage. So this e5 is really harmless. But d4, cd, queen d4 makes some sense. So now knight c6 is main move. I think Hikaru played a6 against me, but that is not so accurate, because white has e5, knight c6, queen a4, and black is practically forced to go into this position, taking on e5, playing bishop d7, knight d7, queen d7. I played bishop d2 here, trying to make long castle, and I was pressing the whole game. Nakamura managed finally to make a draw, but it's not completely equal. White is a little better here, so I would definitely recommend you to play knight c6. Here, bishop b5, bishop d7. And, okay, now with queen d3, for instance, black just plays g6, bishop g7, having a fantastic dragon, and no problem. So the main line goes like this: bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, because if you take with a pawn, then e5 might be unpleasant. So bishop takes e6, bishop g5, e6, long castle, bishop e7. It's a quite well-known theoretical position, but white is not really fighting for advantage here. Even more than that, it's probably black who can try to become ambitious already here. Rook h1, long short castle. Well, white can probably equalize by playing e5 and trying to change all pieces, but is not fighting for advantage. Normally, white would play king b1 and then try to get the setup like queen d2, knight d4. For example, if black plays quite reasonable move queen c7, then white would do queen d2 and knight d4, rook b8, f3, g4, starting some attack there. Black is starting his counterplay, so it would lead to this position. For example, very complicated and clear position when both sides has trumps, objectively probably pretty equal, but of course, very complex position. But in fact, then Garry Kasparov, he kind of buried this line, I believe, playing against Peter Svidler in Linares 99, I think. He played h6, and this is very strong, because white cannot anymore even get this setup. The problem for white is that if he takes a pawn, that by force black is actually getting a better endgame, queen b6, and computer pretends that it's pretty forced now. They play queen d2, rook d8, queen e3, taking on c3, and after all exchanges, black takes the pawn on e4 back with a better endgame. So then Peter Svidler played bishop h4, and now not the only move by far, but Garry played rook e8, showing another piece of his excellent preparation. And actually, it's not clear what to do next with white, because he cannot really play queen d2. I mean, he can, but black has, first of all, rook c8 is possible, but actually knight takes e4 simply works. Knight takes e4, and now, okay, in this position, it's only black who can fight for something. Therefore, Peter played bishop g3, and after d5, black, with the idea e5, knight e4, black at least equalized, and Garry won the game in a great style, as usual. So I don't think this line is very prosperous also for white. I mean, it's complicated and playable. Again, depends on the level and time control, but in general, definitely it shouldn't worry you if you are playing d6 with black. So another couple of side lines. First is d4, c takes d4, queen takes d4. Also quite popular. I mean, one of the ways to avoid playing, learning a lot of theory and just to play a game. But again, do not cause black too many problems. Knight c6. Now bishop b5. Well, black sometimes white just plays queen e3, g6, bishop e2, and playing this kind of position. h3 castles, rook d1, let's say bishop e6. Well, in Dragon, in general, if white is not playing for long castle and for mate, most of the time black has a perfectly fine position. And here white lost quite some tempest with a queen. Well, it's an equal playable position, no more than that. So the main move is bishop b5. And now recently in the candidates in Madrid, there was a game, I think that Firuza, he equalized with black against Rapport. He just played a6. Main line is bishop d7, but a6 is also very principal move and might as well be good enough. Take on c6, bc6, c4, and now e5, queen d3, knight e7. Very straightforward way of playing. Black wants to play maybe even f5, or at least knight g6, bishop e7, castle f5 to have a very active play. So Rapport played c5, and then black went knight g6, cd, queen takes d6, and this endgame is, well, fairly equal. White has a nominal plus. Well, he almost managed to win the game, but objectively it's pretty equal position. So one of the few possible ways for black to equalize in this line, probably. But normally black is playing bishop d7, bishop takes c6. Here b takes c6 is also possible, c4, e5, queen d3, only that knight e7 move is already not working, but after, let's say, bishop e6, it's not clear if white really has anything. Most of the players, they take with a bishop on c6, and now in case of knight c3, black can transpose to the variation we have just looked at, knight f6. So the other way of, that's why white is trying to play it before knight c3, just to have c4 option, and knight c3, well, playable, yeah, playable. At least you have a game here with white, but black can probably equalize. Well, the most simple is knight f6. Quite interesting is f5. Actually, a strange looking move, but you are trying to activate your bishop on c6. So after ef, queen a5 check, knight c3, queen takes f5, knight d5, black plays e5 here, queen d1, rook c8, followed by knight f6, and according to engines again, he is probably equalizing at the end of the day. But if you don't want to play sharp, and sometimes again this such sidelines, black just wants to develop and to get a normal game, that is definitely achievable after knight f6, knight c3, and maybe now g6 already. Queen d3, bishop g7, both sides castle, and there were quite many games in this position. Well, I think it's perfectly equal actually, but maybe a little bit more pleasant to play with white, but in general, well, that is not something I would be worried about playing black, yeah, this kind of outcome of the opening. So this is queen takes d4, another, well, small sideline, knight takes d4, knight f6, and now f3. White is trying to build up c4, knight c3, of course, to build up the center. Well, the main problem of f3 is that actually e5 seems to be quite a direct equalizer. e5, it's very forced. Of course, if you want just to play a game, you can maybe try to play knight c6, but first of all, at minimum, white can transpose to this big theoretical line after knight c3, but also it's not so easy to equalize after c4. So I would rather advise to play e5 in this position. Now knight b3 is the best move, because white have tried a bit bishop b5 check, knight d7, knight f5, this very aggressive approach, but actually it doesn't really work well, because black has a very important move d5 here, e takes d5, a6. And in fact, well, maybe white should really try to equalize very quickly here, let's say by playing bishop e2, knight b6, knight e3, but it's clear that black will just take the pawn on d5 back and having, of course, no problem at all. But if he keeps on playing aggressive, bishop a4, trying to hold this pawn, I think it can easily be better for black. Knight c5, knight e3, bishop d6, then black castles, plays e4, and having a huge compensation, which is more than enough for the pawn. So it's very dangerous to play like this with white. So that's why after e5, usually knight b3 is played in this position. And now d5. Well, if you want a game with black, you can play in this fashion, like bishop e7, c4, that is the idea for white, and then a5. I think Garry Kasparov liked to play like this. It's a complicated position, bishop e6, bishop e2. Sometimes black has this a4, a3 ideas. It might not be objectively completely enough for equality, but it's complicated and pretty playable, I would say, for black. But that wouldn't probably worry white so much. But what is worrying really white is the d5 move. And it seems to me that this move is actually just equalizing. Yeah, it's very difficult for white to find anything here. Bishop g5, that is the idea. e5 obviously is queen takes d5, gives nothing for white. So bishop g5. Now bishop e6 is a main theoretical move. But actually d4 is very interesting, extremely straightforward. So if it works, then it just kills the line, in my opinion. So c3, knight c6. Now, don't ask me why, but after bishop b5, very important move is h6. And the computer says that black is at least equal after h6, because all other moves gives white some plus, but for some reason h6 is important. So that's why c takes d4. And now bishop b4 check. e4 doesn't work so well. Here white seems to be better in this position. But after cd, bishop b4 check, bishop d2. Now some crazy play starts. Knight takes e4. And here it goes, some very complicated line. Bishop b4 check, g3, takes, queen takes h1. The bishop is hanging. Bishop c5. Also bishop a3 possible, but for some reason to c5 is supposed to be more accurate. And now bishop h3, knight d2, long castle. Very direct play. Queen c2. There is a queen e2 also move, but queen c2 is the main move. Bishop takes f1, long castle. The bishop is pinned. So queen h6, rook takes f1, b6 only move. And this very, very strange, complicated position finally, which is actually pretty forced, I think, after d4. Well, you need to analyze further, but computer assesses it as equal, whatever it means. But if it's really okay for black, then maybe this is the most direct way to equalize. But the thing is that bishop e6 is also pretty fine. I mean, if now e5, queen d5 gives nothing, so white is taking on f6, at least forcing black to take with a pawn. Ed, queen takes d5, exchanging queens, knight c3, bishop e6, long castle. Yeah, well, this is position black can more or less, as you see, get by force in this f3 variation. And it seems that he is holding here, but you better know well what you do with black. You better check it a bit with the engines, because things are not so easy. Anish Girian, he is very, very good in preparation, so I'm pretty sure he made his homework. He preferred to play knight c6 here. And after bishop b5, rook c8, white has quite a number of options, but probably black is equalizing at the end. For example, if knight a5, king a7 works, you see some difficult moves black has to find. So again, better if you instead of finding it over the board, just memorize it, check it with the computer, and remember it by heart. Or let's say knight d5, f5. Well, it seems that black is also fine here. Maybe a bit simpler is to play knight d7. This is like old main line, so to say. And now the game goes knight b5, king e7. Otherwise, this unpleasant check was threatening on c7. So king b1, bishop h6. As you understand, you could have checked on h6, king b1, and only then play king e7. And this position, well, if bishop d3, nowadays engines are showing this move as the first line. After f5, white has some tries, but all in all, black is equalizing. And there were some games, earlier games, pre-computer era. White would play knight c7, rook d8, knight d5 check, takes on d5, and of course now white wants to get control on the white squares, ideally to put his bishop on f5, and then he would be better, but black has this tactical resource knight c5, using the weakness of the first rank, and bishop c4 taking on d5, rook d8. Well, white is having a very nominal plus, but basically it's a draw, of course. So this line is quite serious. I mean, you need to know with black what you do, and you can probably try it with white also, but frankly, if you analyze it well, I have a feeling that both d4 here and this endgame after bishop e6 will be sterilized sort of, and it will lead to a draw basically, most likely. And at the end of this session before bishop b5, I want just to attract your attention on the move knight f6. Sometimes some players are playing like this, d4, knight f6. So the idea is that in case of knight c3, black just wants to take on d4, and like this, black avoids the lines cd4, knight d4, which I've just shown you, knight f6, f3, and at the same time avoiding force queen d4. Yeah, so I mean this bishop b5 and then playing c4. So some players, they decide that this is a correct move order, and it might actually equalize, but dc5 still, there are still some questions after dc5, because if knight c3, as I've mentioned already, cd4 is black transposes to main lines, and without those couple of options I've just mentioned. Bishop b5 check, bishop d7 takes, queen takes d7 also seems to be harmless. But dc5, white can maybe still try to get some small advantage after dc5. Knight takes e4, c takes d6. Now knight c6 is the most accurate move. And probably the best try for white is bishop e3 here. And maybe white can be a bit better. Let's say if in case of knight takes d6, knight c3, g6, knight b5 is a little bit unpleasant. Some small advantage maybe for white. That's why e5 is the computer's first line. But still, I don't know, this position, bishop d3, knight takes d6, knight c3, bishop e7, queen e2. Well, computers give a very small advantage for white, 0-2 maybe. It's a position to analyze, but I guess if this position is fine, then you can easily also start with knight f6, even though, as we saw, both of those, queen d4 here or knight d4, knight f6, f3, both of those lines are perfectly okay for black. So it's up to you to choose. But anyway, most of the players start with c takes d4 just to make it simple. Yeah. So I think we have finished all the other moves than bishop b5 check and d4. So now we will move to this bishop b5 check, which is quite popular because it's a way for white to fight for a small advantage without much risk and without tons of theory after, of course, as in many lines of the main Sicilian. So let us move to bishop b5 check, probably the most popular anti-Naider, so to say, the line after d6 if white doesn't want to play main lines with d4. Now there are three ways, four, but we will not consider queen d7. There are three ways to play knight c6, bishop d7, knight d7. Let's start with knight c6. I think this line is really in trouble now, at least at minimum because of the simple main line, even though white has other options, but Seems that black cannot equalize here after castles, bishop d7, rook e1. So white simply wants to get his c3 d4. Now if black plays a6, then you take on c6, play d4, it just, there is too big lead in development for white. So after cd, knight d4, rook c8, c4, knight f6, knight c3, we have a typical structure. In some variations, let's say after queen takes d4, cd, queen takes d4, black can get the structure, but having 2-3 tempest up, and here the lead in development is too serious, and white should be simply better. So after rook e1, knight f6 is usually played. Then c3, a6, bishop f1. Well, now you have to stop white from simply playing d4 and get in a better position. So bishop g4. And I think the most principle is d4. Here it's a real try to get an advantage. Even though, let's say after h3, taking on f3, g6, now this typical idea in case of queen d1, black can play bishop h6, just stopping d4. That should be more or less okay, but simply d3, bishop g7, let's say bishop e3, castle, knight d2, white is ready to play d4, black trying to play knight d7, then b5, but still white has two bishop. It might still be a bit better for white, even though of course not too much, but the d4 is really causing a lot of problems. cd4, cd4. Now d5 or e5. Well, I think e5 is a lesser evil, because after d5, e5, it really gets extremely dangerous. For black, knight g8, of course, yes, black wants to get e6, then knight e7, attacking the pawn on d4, but just losing too many tempests to that it works. It shouldn't really work. You can see how big is white's lead in development. So here, first of all, I'm not quite sure that just playing like this that black can fully equalize, but there is also very, very dangerous move e6. Bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, simply an exchange sacrifice, fe, queen b3, and okay, black needs a lot of time to develop still, and white has a very powerful initiative. Okay, it's exchange down, no really big threats. I mean, not that white is just winning material soon, and already engines can assassinate slightly better for white. So my guess is that it's in a practical game, it's actually practically unplayable for black, just very difficult to play, on top of the fact that probably objectively it's not good. Therefore e5, and now I'm not quite sure that after a very simple bishop e3 move black can fully equalize. Well, let's say just playing like this, and gf takes, bishop e7, knight c3, let's say castles a4. Also black has to to prove that his position is fine. But d5 is principle. Now it gets pretty forced played. Knight d4, bishop e3, takes, bishop d7. Of course, black has, very nice squares, f4 for his knight, etc. Of course, if he would develop, would just be better, but it's very direct position. And white is playing knight d2, trying to get knight c4, knight b6. And after b5, a4, very quickly attacking the queen side. And, well, black is suffering here. Maybe can manage to hold it, but this typical mating attack is not going to come very soon. It's not going to come at all, and white is already starting to break through on the queen side. So I don't think that knight c6 is actually is a move I can recommend you if you play black this variation. But actually both bishop d7 and knight d7. Well, let's start with bishop d7. For some reason, nowadays on the top level, knight d7 becomes much more popular, but there is no problem as far as I understand with bishop d7. So in my time, when 90s, bishop d7 was much, much more popular, and then probably it's a matter of fashion for some reason. Knight d7 became more fashionable, maybe because black players who play Najdorf, they They like more complicated game. After bishop d7, white is pretty safe, of course, in most of the line, but also black doesn't, in my opinion, do not really experience any problems. I mean, there are certain dangers, strategical dangers, but if you are well prepared with black, if you spend a bit of time analyzing some positions, which I'm going to show you, a couple of critical positions in this line, I don't really think it's going to be any problem. But knight d7, by the way, also is doing pretty fine for the moment. Just that bishop d7 gives white much less options to fight for advantage. So bishop takes d7 check. Well, queen takes d7 was always supposed to be the main move. Now knight takes d7 actually becoming also quite popular, and seems that black also is very close to equalize here. Castles, knight f6, queen e2, e6, well, g6, c3 should be a bit of, well, advantage for white. Is getting d4, but e6, and now white has two main options. One is just to get the same type of position as we will consider after queen takes d7. So let's say d4, cd4, knight d4, bishop e7, c4. Of course, if white is just developing his knight on c3, black plays a6, castles, and have no problem at all. So c4, and okay, those moves are very logical. Everybody is, developing. Queen a5, rook a d1. There were some games in this position. Rook f8. Let's say king h1. White plan is probably to play f4, knight f3, e5. But as usual in these structures, he has to be very careful about black getting d5, b5, so it's not so to realize this plan and to make use of this space advantage is quite difficult here. And for instance, if bishop f8, I think maybe it's not the most accurate. f4, queen h5, knight f3, again there were games. It's probably with a very accurate play black can manage to equalize at some point, but white wants to play e5 already. Black has to be careful. I think that probably queen h5 is more accurate. Now exchanging queens. I think there was a game Anand-Carlsen. Anand changed queens, but this shouldn't be really. In this endgame, it's very typical. Black usually is fine. And then, okay, queen h5 is stopping this f4 idea, f3. And now, for instance, quite interesting move, bishop d8, trying to get, also pretty typical for those structures, maybe trying to get the bishop to c7, then d5 might start to come, also to b6 sometimes. Well, it's a game, yeah, it's a position, playable for both sides, but yeah, nothing really to worry about with black so much, but also playable with white. Well, actually c3 was supposed to be quite dangerous for black, but now computers found this a bit strange, but hard to fight against idea. Bishop e7, d4, and if cd d5, this is a typical way to counter this c3 d4 plan, but here I'm not quite sure if it works because white has knight e1 idea. I mean, you really need knight on c6, yeah, in these positions. So after bishop d7, queen takes d7, this type of position is usually fine for black. With a knight on d7, I'm not so sure already, or even knight d2 might be a bit better for white. So this I wouldn't recommend, but simply castle. Strangely enough, just giving up the center. Well, nowadays engines pretend that black is doing quite fine. For example, after e5, he's playing knight e8. Doesn't look great, I understand, but very difficult to find anything for white here in case of dc knight c5, so probably just equal. Another logical move is rook d1, then queen c7. Then queen c7, so black is just developing, maybe one day thinking about d5. And e5 never really works in the sense that, it's not crushing or giving an advantage. For instance, here looks a bit dubious, black's position. I mean, not that I like it so much visually, but again, engines are nowadays quite powerful and pretend that this is just equal. So knight takes d7 also actually playable for black. But queen takes d7, yeah, I don't actually even understand really why it's gone out of fashion. I mean, definitely white has some tries here, but very few. In fact, I think the only way for white to really try to get a slight plus is to play c4 in this position. Because if white is playing castle, knight f6, let's say queen e2, okay, rook e1 is even is even more harmless, because knight c6, c3, just e6, and now simply d5, e5, knight e4 is completely equal. So if you already want to play this c3 plan, then maybe queen e2, better with a queen on e2, c3, e6, d4, takes, d5. Now already you see the knight is on c6, and that makes a big difference. e5, knight e4, because the pawn on d4 is under pressure. Bishop e3, bishop e7. Of course, white can always exchange the knight, playing knight d2 and just with an equal position. But if he wants to fight for something, he should go knight e1 here, trying to trap this knight. But f6, f3, knight g5. There were quite many games in this position. It's just fine for black, no problem. Simply equal. So then the only way for, to fight for something is playing c4. Here, and that's the way most of top players are playing, and trying to pretend that white is slightly better. Again, it's true that if white managed to settle all this so-called Marazzi structure, trying to play d4, takes, knight to c3, b3, f3, he can be slightly better, even though not so much. I mean, black's position is very solid. But it's very difficult, in fact, to manage it. So if you are black, if you want to play this line, you need to pay a lot of attention here on about different move orders. How exactly to play. For instance, knight c6 and knight f6, there is quite a significant difference. Another story is that there is a strange move e5. A little bit strange because, limiting your bishop. But it seems like d5 square is weakened. But then at least like this, black can stop white from playing d4. And quite strong players were playing it. I mean, also very strong. Even Magnus Carlsen have played it once. d3, and then black's plan is to play bishop e7, bishop d8, knight g7, sometimes trying to get f5. It might be perfectly playable. In fact, probably white's only chance to get something is to try quickly to play b4. So a3, bishop d8, castle, knight e7, b4. If black takes on b4, then white gets bishop a3 and very big initiative. So probably black should just ignore it. Castle, maybe trying to play b6 makes some sense also, has to be checked. And now white probably should play knight d5. Actually, in the game, I think Kovalov totally outplayed Magnus, strangely enough, and he had a completely winning position. But probably Magnus, whether he was played for a win, trying to complicate matters, or it was just not his day. But the position shouldn't be too bad for black, because maybe he has these ideas to play in f5 one day. Maybe it's still a bit better for white, but it's worth investigating, because if you find equality here, then it's very difficult to get any idea for white in this bishop b5 check, bishop d7 variation. Then again, most popular for quite a long time, the most popular logical move order was to play knight c6, while white playing d4, takes, then g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and now, of course, if white plays bishop e3, knight f6, this position we will consider later. We have the knight f6 move order instead of knight c6. Here white can play f3 or h3, just stopping knight g4. So, but maybe via this move order there is a bit original, maybe a little dubious, but quite interesting plan, which is to play knight h6, and after logical move f3, then to go f5. I don't know how to assess this position. Let's say queen d2, knight f7, white should probably take on f5, gf5. Maybe it's a little bit better for white, maybe not, because black has his own play, potentially on g line. Hard to say, but it's possible to play like this. So this is a plus to start with knight c6, that you have this knight h6 plan. But the minus is that white already can play knight d2 in this position. And that would lead probably to a little bit better version for white than if you start with knight f6 instead of knight c6. So now still knight h6 is possible, but a bit dubious already because you don't have this knight g4 idea. So white bishop is on c1 still. I have my doubts it's enough to equalize already, but again, playable. Normally black is playing knight f6 and white is going f3, castles, let's say a6, a4, and this is a very typical position. A lot of games were played. I think I've played it in my candidate match against Boris Gelfand back in 1994, very long time ago. It was just the popularity of this variation was just starting to rise. I mean, it was one of the very few debates in this line on the top level. Yeah, now it's becoming, now all top players have this bishop b5 check in his repertoire. The repertoire with white, also with black playing this position. That is playable for white. I mean, it doesn't look like it's a big deal, but for example, he always liked Boris Gelfand to play immediately queen d8, queen a5, something like this, rook b1, rook c8. White is usually trying to play b3 here. But even if this position looks pretty harmless and almost equal, but it has a venom. I mean, at some point on, if white manages to stop all black's counterplay, and black's counterplay usually is connected with b5 sometimes, or e6, d5. So one day, if he manages to settle it, b3, bishop e3, queen d2, slowly, then black is kind of running out of play, and white can really get an advantage here. Actually, I won one of those games in this match, in this variation. So that is playable for white. I mean, not so easy to equalize fully with black. Again, I mean, it's extremely solid for black, so there will be no big problem for sure. But still, playing black, you probably want to equalize fully. Yeah? So I would advise you to try knight f6 variation maybe, because now there is a major difference. Knight c3, g6, so white has to play d4, takes, bishop g7. Well, the main point is that now white is just not in time, and it was, discovered, I mean, already many years ago, but still after quite a long time, that starting with knight f6, when black is playing with this move order, that white cannot anymore get his knight to e2, just tactically, because after castles, now, f3, that's the way people played, and it was considered like knight c6 anyway has to be played here, because there is a move order b3, knight c6, bishop b2, but then it's very difficult to stop d5. Yeah, bishop on b2 in this position is not so good, and after e6, let's say rook c1, rook d8, black simply manages d5, and if he manages it under favorable circumstances, it's just equalizing. Yeah, I mean, in case of e5, as I understand, black can play d takes e4. So queen d7, knight d7. So that's why f3, and now black has a very, very nice tactics, which is important to know if you're playing this variation. Rook c8, b3, and d5. Really, amazing tactical resource. And it seems to work, as strange as it looks, but seems to work, and actually it probably just leads to a draw, actually, because if knight takes d5, e6, this is not good, black is even better here. So then e5 is quite harmless also, just knight e8, and okay, everything works tactically. Knight takes d5, e6, knight retreats, bishop takes e5, okay, knight d2, maybe white is already trying to equalize. Well, basically it's equal position. And after e takes d5, this is of course very logical. Knight takes d5, amazing tactics. Of course, only computers probably could find it. I don't think any human would have found these tactics. Knight takes d5, e6. Okay, it looks crazy, just giving up the knight, and it seems like white should have some way to get an advantage, but actually not. There are many games, and it's a forced draw. let's say, this variation, it's practically forced, knight b5, and there are many games, knight b7, take, knight c6, and draw. So yeah, that's a very important. That's why now most of players, they like to start with knight f6. So white just cannot manage to settle his pieces in the most favorable way. So he has to try some other setups somehow. Well, sometimes what now becomes again fashionable, a move h3, just trying to put h3 and bishop e3. But I mean, well, actually, the whole point of this position is that, okay, if white manages to settle bishop e3, b3, rook c1, at least, yeah, he can at least play this position. The question is, does he really manage? I mean, it's very difficult to find a move order for white that black doesn't break through immediately with e6 d5 or e6 b5. So h3 is a new fashionable move order, not really because I think because white players, they like it, just because they cannot find a way how to get a game. So h3 bishop e3 is quite strange, because normally, well, it's logical and it was supposed to be the only setup is, instead of h3, to play f3 in this position and bishop e3. But as we saw, it also has some tactical, I mean, concrete problems. So h3, I find it hard to believe that it's going to be very dangerous, frankly. But I saw very strong players, including Magnus Carlsen, playing like this. What I can recommend, there is first of all very interesting move, queen c7, very rare move, but again, just trying to solve all the problems, if there are any problems, to solve them tactically. So queen c7 is a serious move, because after b3 it gets very direct. Queen a5, bishop d2, knight takes e4, tactics, knight e4, queen e5, and let's say queen b1, f5 seems to be well, kind of draw here, just very drawish. So white is sometimes playing queen e2 here, at least, yeah, otherwise the pawn is hanging. And after knight c6, again, there is a lot of tactics, so he seems to, well, to be forced kind of to play knight c2. And again, there is still a question if white will manage to develop without black breaking, through with b5 or d5. It's still a question. Let's say a6 and castles e6, and it's not so comfortable for white. I mean, if he is in time, bishop d2, rook c1, rook d1, b3, maybe he can be a bit better, but it's not even clear if he manages. So it's queen c7 is an interesting move against this move order. But actually, I think also there is no problem. There are many games, castle, bishop e3, knight c6, this typical position, castles a6. Well, black wants to take on d4 and play b5, so let's say a4. And now again, you can of course always play in this kind of Gelfand style, something like this, rook b1. At least here maybe white is a bit better. I mean, he manages. But e6 is quite direct here, and again, yeah, it's always this d5 is hanging in the air. I mean, very little for white, if anything. For instance, this looks logical, not so easy to. For white has to be extremely careful not to allow d5 with a total liquidation. So queen f3, strange move, maybe the way, but still after queen e7, let's say rook d1, knight d7, I'm not actually sure white can, manage to stabilize his position and to start slowly pressing. So I don't think it represents any real problem, h3 move. And then, okay, so then there is only one thing left, which is f3, castles. Again, now castles will transpose. If white is trying to be clever to play knight d2 first, and after rook c8, b3, then black has b5 simply, and everything works. So bishop e3, now this is the way how white is trying to, at least to get a game. Not, maybe it would be too strong to say that he's trying to fight for advantage, but at least he wants to get a playable position. Castles a6, and now queen d3. Because again, if a4, e6 is becoming, well, extremely difficult to stop d5. For example, rook c1, black can play a useful move here, of course, but actually he is already in time playing knight e5, b3, d5, just equalizes. This is, by the way, one of the games of Garry Kasparov was like this. So that's why now the main line is a very strange looking move, queen d3, but it's probably like almost the only move how somehow to stop black from, getting his very quick equality. For example, if rook c1, then black can just takes and already push b5. If a4, as we saw, then d5 is hard to stop. So queen d3 is a sad necessity for white just to keep on game going somehow. And here, of course, black can, as always, play e6 and, this typical move. So rook c8, queen d8, of course, if he wants. But again, there is a very direct also way of playing, which seems to be, probably enough to equalize. Knight e5, queen e2, rook c8, b3, b5, very direct, knight d5. Otherwise, black can just be better. So knight d5, takes, e6 now. Very concrete line, important line. Of course, white can try to, to press a bit, taking on e6, d6, but it's really very little. It's actually very drawish. And in case of f4, ed5, that is tactics, takes, knight f3, d4, knight e1, very unclear position, but should be okay for black, I believe. So, frankly, I don't see why people stop playing bishop d7. Maybe just that they don't want to get confused in all those move orders. But it's more, I think, white who has a chance of getting confused there. And I'm not sure. It has to be analyzed maybe deeper if you're playing on the top level, if you're a top grandmaster. Otherwise, I think it's perfectly enough for you to play this knowledge I gave you now on bishop d7 is already enough. But it might easily happen that white simply doesn't have a way to manage to at least to get a game with, to settle this position and to play. Another question is already if there is any real plus in this position, if he manages his b3 and so on. But for the moment, I'm not quite sure there is a way actually, for white to manage anything here. So a little bit strange why nowadays knight d7 is played like 2 times more often than bishop d7 on the top level, because I don't really see any problem with bishop d7. But now let's move to knight d7. So this is of course much less straightforward. I mean that after knight d7 at least white will always get some position to play, but objectively it's also doing pretty fine, at least in the modern state of theory. There is no real advantage for white after knight d7, but the game is more complicated, and white can probably has more chances to achieve his goal, is just to get a complicated playable position. So bishop b5 check, knight d7. Now obviously the most logical, the main move is castles, but let's check other options. c3 is actually playable, no more than that, but perfectly playable for white. Knight f6, has to play queen e2, that's the minus of starting with c3, you cannot play rook e1 anymore. a6, bishop a4, and black has at least two strategically different way of playing. One is to try to play e5, so the positions remind Ruy Lopez. Here, let's say castle, bishop e7, d4, b5, bishop c2, castles. Now maybe the best move is d5. Black has quite comfortable type of Ruy Lopez, because in this Chigorin system the knight is on c6, and then after d5 has to go to a5 or b8. Here it's already on d7, but still it's playable for white. Actually white has pretty good statistics here. I would say that black should be able probably to get a decent game, but still playable. More popular is playing just to play b5, bishop c2, and now bishop d7. Let's say d4, e6. This setup, castles, bishop e7. Actually, it looks like white has some chances to be a bit better, because he got his center, and looks like it shouldn't be so easy for black. But strangely enough, computers are extremely happy with black here, saying that it's equal or even sometimes slightly better. I don't know, logically, I cannot explain why, but also practice proved that, it's just a complicated equal position. So let's say rook e1, castle knight d2, queen c7. That's a normal way the game can develop, knight f1. Now there is a cd e5, this type of play, which computer also considers as more or less equal, this position. Or rook fc8, bishop d3, because black wants to take on d4, and simply b4, let's say knight g3, a5. Again, humanly looks like it can be dangerous because white has some potential attack on the king side, but computers are laughing at this attack. Bishop f4, bishop f8, rook a d1 is playing even rook a b8, a strange move, and giving or h6 and saying that black is at least equal. Well, maybe who am I to argue, but it looks like there must be a way for white to play at least this position, even though, I would agree that black is doing fine. So that is about c3 move. Then what else? c4. Also perfectly playable move. Knight f6, knight c3. I think now you need to play g6. It's better to play g6. Of course, there is always an option to play e5 here, and this bishop on b5 is a bit strange, but again, always e5, especially with a knight on d7, so the knight is not getting to d4. It's not really my cup of tea. e6, in fact, here white might get slightly better, because castle, bishop e7, d4, takes, and now castle, now we actually will consider this approximately this position with white having his rook on e1, so played rook e1, then black is just in time to be to equalize. Here white has bishop a4 move and is in time to settle finally this structure. Black cannot really manage to stop white from developing and keeping this structure with e4 pawns, because in many lines black is just by force attacking this c4 pawn. Here he's not in time, and it seems that white has some plus here. For instance, if a6, king h1. In case of knight e5, bishop b3, a6, king h1, next f4, and probably black haven't equalized fully. So after knight c3, I would probably advise you to play g6 here with black. Castles, bishop g7, d4, takes, castle. So white's problem is that, again, of course, if his bishop would be on e2, he would have a very nice, comfortable plus, but it's very difficult to manage to keep this bishop. In fact, now probably the best move is bishop takes d7. It's a bit sad to give up the bishop for this knight, but otherwise he simply cannot manage to settle this position, because, for instance, if now bishop a4, queen b6 seems to be very annoying tactically. Again, if bishop e3, then b2 pawn is hanging. By the way, after bishop a4, also knight b6 is possible, because you have to put the bishop on b3, and knight d7. Again, knight c5, knight e5, especially knight e5 is coming. It's not easy to manage to protect this pawn on c4, but queen b6 is even stronger. Actually, computer barely manages to equalize here with white, because let's say knight e2, because the knight takes e4 was threatening. And now queen c7 is fine, bishop b3, knight b6, attacking this pawn on c4. But the best is just knight c5, bishop c2, and now both queen a6 is good. Also bishop e6 is fine, attacking the pawn. Again, you cannot play b3 because of knight takes e4. So just by tempest, white cannot manage to get his structure, to stabilize the position and develop normally. So that's why bishop takes d7 is played, bishop takes d7, queen d3. Well, that is one of those playable positions white can get in this system. a6, a4. Quite a number of games was played here, but frankly, I don't really see why it should be anything for white, because of course, it would be much more useful to have, not to exchange the bishop for the knight. So here, let's say knight g4, knight f3, rook c8. it must be okay for black. I don't think, even if white gets maybe some tiny plus here, it will not be very serious, but it's, again, probably he will not get even that. So c4 is not too dangerous, but maybe, yeah, it's important to know that you have to play here g6. Then another quite serious move already, popular move, is d4. There is an option to play knight f6. Here I wouldn't recommend it because it's a bit it's complicated, it's a bit risky, and I don't see why actually to play like that, because with the logical normal moves black is can get a very decent position instead. So the idea is that if e5 there is some cd, some very strange position can happen like this: queen b5, take, knight d4, queen a6, I think, and computer says it's just equal, which is probably true. There is another move, knight c3, takes, queen takes d4. Now if a6 is not so great because you take bishop g5, and if you remember we had something similar position with a bishop on c6 already, so here white has some chances to get an advantage. Usually e5 is played here, queen d3, h6, because white wants to play bishop g5, and this is complicated position, not so easy for black. I mean, quite dangerous, but according to engines, at least here, bishop b7, it's pretty direct. a4, queen a5 is very important move, and maybe here black is equalizing finally. But all in all, yeah, after knight f6, white has chances for some advantage. So I think cd is much more played much more often. Now there is some strange way. Knight takes d4 recently people started to play knight f6 castles, and let's say a6 bishop d3, trying to play like this. Frankly, I don't really believe in it, but has to be checked. But the main move is queen takes d4, and now a6. Probably bishop e2. This is a move which is now most popular, because bishop takes d7 check, bishop takes d7 is quite harmless probably. I mean, c4, that is the idea. Normally that white again wants to get this Maratzi structure. If knight c3, then e5, queen d3, rook c8, also quite a typical position. Yeah, there were many games on this structure, pawn structure. It seems that black should have enough to equalize here. And after c4, actually both are fine now. You can play slowly, simply, like knight f6, knight c3, g6. Maybe white has a slightly better version than in this line after force c4, which we have checked. At least black played a6. White didn't take on d7 on his own, so black has a pawn on a6. Still, yeah, it probably leads to more or less the same, and this position is probably just fine for black, normal playable position. More principle even is to play instead of knight f6, e5 here, queen d3, b5, and probably it just equalizes actually. Knight c3, b c4, queen c4, bishop e6. Okay, there were many games ended in a draw in this way. But queen d3 if white wants to keep on playing, and h6, castle, knight f6, so black just develops. White has to try rook d1, bishop e7, probably knight e1, trying to maneuver the knight to via c2 to e3 to d5, but it's a long way, and in the meantime black manages to equalize quite some games here, and it seems that it's just equal. So that's why now more fashionable is bishop e2, but still it just leads to a complicated game, no more than that. So knight f6. Now if c4, well, at least after g6 it's playable, because at least white managed to keep his white square bishop. Castle, queen e3, b6 with a pretty typical structure, h3. I think that black is okay. I mean, it's a matter of taste. Yeah, so whether you like to play it with black or with white, but objectively, of course, white got not the best version of this structure, because he has his queen is on e3, knight on f3, pawn on h3, not really. Okay, if you get knight on d4, pawn on f3, bishop on e3, it's a different story. Yeah, here black, in my opinion, should be okay, completely fine, but even more direct is e5 here. Actually, it's a computer is playing like this, and after queen e3, now d5. Very strange, but seems to work. At least computer is very happy about it. Don't ask me why, but is giving this line, and black has quite some play in this position. So therefore, usually white is trying to castle first, and now again you can play g6. Probably white, well, most likely will play c4 and get to this playable, complicated position. But again, e5 is possible. Queen e3, and now knight c5, trying to not to allow white playing c4, knight c3. Yeah, so let's say if black starts with bishop e7, then white can get c4, and after knight c5 he has knight c3. That's why knight c5 here, and the complicated, again, unclear position. Let's say if knight c3, then already it's quite important that white's pawn is on c2, so black just continues developing, bishop e7, bishop d7. It's a very typical, this neither type of position. Well, I don't think neither players would be worried here. It's just unclear, complicated and unclear. Another way to protect this pawn is knight fd2. Because again, if white, of course, playing knight bd2, then c4 doesn't make so much sense already. You need the knight on c3 in these positions. After knight fd2, already black just continues, bishop e7. So white finally managed his c4, knight c3 setup. But of course, this knight d2 move is not ideal, to put it mildly. So black just goes bishop d7, a4, rook c8. And, well, okay, of course, strategically, white is doing well. I mean, if you imagine he will transfer the knight from d2 to d5 and settle his pieces in the best positions. But, well, it's easier said than done. It's clear that it's impossible to get the second knight on d5. And white has a very strange setup with this knight on d2, queen on e3, very disharmonial. So I believe black should be really just fine here. Again, complicated and clear position. So all in all, yeah, d4 is also not too dangerous, just leads to a complicated game. That's why castles is most popular. Now, actually both moves are okay, a6 and knight f6. I would advise you to play knight f6. I think it's simpler. a6 also playable, by the way. There is nothing really wrong with a6. Bishop takes d7, bishop d7 is just okay for black. Let's say c3, knight f6, rook e1, e6, d4. From time to time white is playing like this, but here once white gave up his white square bishop, black can even just play bishop e7. I mean, in this modest way, castles with two bishops probably must be quite okay. Also, there is nothing really wrong playing d5 and knight e4 here. So that is quite harmless. That's why bishop d3, this strange move, is played at least to keep the pawn protected, then trying to go rook e1, etc. Now the idea is that in case of b5, maybe it's a bit premature because white is playing c4 and having a good game. I mean, here black has to solve his problems with the b5 pawn. So bishop d3, knight f6. Now, yeah, well, nothing really wrong with this position for black. I mean, it's perfectly fine. So rook e1 or c3, two logical moves. c3, then again, here black has quite a number of options. Even there is some strange move, knight e5 possible, bishop e2, knight g6. There were some games probably playable. I would, as a classical player, I would prefer to play in more logical, classical way. b5, bishop c2, bishop b7, rook e1. And now there is an interesting move, c4, a4, e6, which might also be completely fine for black. But even playing in the same fashion, e6, d4, bishop e7, as we already saw. Okay, the only difference was that queen was on e2 instead of rook e1, probably it's a bit more favorable for white to have rook e1 instead of queen e2. But anyways, position is perfectly okay for black, just a complicated position. So rook e1 is more popular. The idea is that in case of e6, white wants to play c4. I mean, to get this structure, knight c3, castles, bishop f1. Still, here b6 takes bishop b7. It's a typical position, but rook e1, bishop f1 is really not the best setup for white. So I wouldn't, being black, I wouldn't mind to play with black, because we assume anyways that knight d7, when black plays knight d7, he wants to play a complicated position and to have certain winning chances. So this is exactly the situation. Okay, maybe it's a bit more comfortable for white because he has more space, but in general, it's perfectly playable for black. I think it's just a complicated, long game which can end in black's victory as well. Yeah. So that is a minimum after rook e1 black can get, so perfectly playable. Quite an interesting move is queen c7. It's just trying to be very direct, you know. So the idea is after c3 to play c4. Maybe white can try to get c4 himself. That's another question. Why not? But most of the players are playing c3, and then there is a strange way b5, a4, b4, even like this. Modern engines are pretty happy with black. I don't know, this looks a bit too much to my taste, to my human old-fashioned taste. But c4 is possible, bishop c2, b5. Again, of course, there is a lack of development, so playing like this, you have to be very careful that you don't, you know, that you are in time to develop. But it was played, for example, by Karyakin, and b3, e6, a4, rook b8. Probably black is in time. At least computer engines are, you know, do not see any way for white to get some advantage, you know, using the lead in development. So maybe again another way of playing is g6, also very normal. So just leading to this type of position, as we already know. Bishop c2, d4, it's very logical. Queen c7, by the way, has quite good statistics. It's queen c7 move. Of course, if you are playing black, you have to be very careful about all those e5 ideas, but seems that here black is in control. Or also cd, b5. Get into this kind of typical position. Now only different that bishop is on g7. Still, it's just playable for both sides. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be too unhappy with white here in this position, but also if I already go, you know, playing knight d7 and playing this line with black, I mean, also it means that I'm pretty fine with this type of position. So again, a6, absolutely playable move, nothing wrong with it, but main line is knight f6 here. Of course, rook e1 is kind of automatic move, but lately white found some bishop a4 move. This is really a strange move. The idea is that, okay, if knight e4, rook e1, knight f6, d4, that it seems that white has a very powerful initiative for the pawn. So the idea is, in case of a6, white wants to play c4 and then get to this knight c3, d4 line. It's a little strange, this whole concept, but I think that here black has a very simple way of getting a good position. I mean, just equalizing, playing e6. After rook e1, bishop e7. And now, well, the point is that in case of c4, castles, if you remember this position when white was playing force c4, then he was in time to play knight c3, so to avoid rook e1. So here white is like, you know, tempi down. Not really tempi, but he's not really in time anymore to settle his pieces, as I mentioned already, to develop somehow and to get this Maratsi structure. Actually, it's pretty important line here, because otherwise white has some chances to be slightly better after d4. But it's pretty direct line. In fact, if black wants to equalize, you know, by tempi, he's just in time to do it. If knight c3, then black simply has knight e5, and let's say this is just nothing for white. So d4 has to be played. takes, and again white wants to play knight c3, bishop c2, b3, and even though, as I've mentioned already, black can definitely play this type of position, but queen c7 is quite a problem for white, because now again you have to solve this issue with the pawn on c4. Bishop b3, well, a bit sad to put bishop on b3, but what to do? a6, knight c3. Again, yeah, I can just mention that you can always play b6 and just get this position. Absolutely playable, of course, but knight e5 is very direct. It's almost basically a forced draw here. Queen e2, pawn was hanging, bishop d7, trying to attack the pawn, next rook c8, so f4. Somehow, what else? Just otherwise you can lose the pawn on c4, knight, and now queen b6. Yeah, this is very important move. And after queen b6, it just gets very direct. Bishop e3, knight g4, knight f5. Okay, very forced line. Bishop d8, very nice move. Yeah, difficult to see it in advance, but if you know it, and I can assure you, top players, they know already this move. Yeah, this leads to basically a forced draw. Knight e7 check, very nice variation. King h8, and now takes, king h1, knight f2 check, and it's just a perpetual here. So c4 is already was quite popular for a while, but now it seems like it's very forced, this line, and seems like a draw. And otherwise c3, and we get to this position which we already know. Yeah, the same type of position I've already shown you. Knight g3, rook e8. Yeah, so something like that, and it's again considered to be quite equal. So black is quite fine. I would be happy with black with this outcome of the opening, because if I want to equalize and to play for equality and maybe to make a draw, I would play bishop b5 check, bishop d7. But if I already want a game, I play knight d7 and I get my game. Yes, here of course position is very complicated. So then rook e1 is a main move. a6. Well, there is some strange way of playing. Again, I'm showing it you maybe more for the black color. If you just want to get a game, this is very strange. e5, knight e8, but seems to be playable also. Anyway, a6 would be my choice, definitely. Bishop f1. So that was the idea. So now white wants to build up his center. For example, e6, c3. Again, now it's a bit more difficult to get these b5 ideas. I think bishop on f1 is maybe a bit better than on c2, because you can start bothering black on the queen side. So normally black can play a6, bishop f1, and probably b6 is quite fine, because now c3 you are not in time to get your d4, c3, bishop b7. Well, the problem is, of course, if you play b5, then a4 becomes a problem. Yes, so b6, c4. Yeah, again, if white is just playing with a knight on c3, then it's not quite clear why he lost all those tempies, playing bishop b5 check, bishop f1. So let's say d4 takes, e6. It's fantastic Sicilian for black, so it just doesn't make sense for white. So the whole idea is to get the structure, to get the pawn on c4, bishop b7, knight c3, and now again it's a position, as I've mentioned already, perfectly playable for both colors. Black can choose whether to play it with the g6, bishop g7, so this type of position, castle, bishop e3, e6, also very, very typical play. Because white setup rook e1, bishop f1 is not perfect in this position. Normally white should try to play on the king side. So if he has bishop on e2, rook on f1, so he has few tempies. So white is trying to push b4, e4, e5 very quickly. In this position. But here he's just not in time to manage it. And to me it's an equal, normal position. I wouldn't mind at all playing black. Another way of playing is to put bishop on e7, also playable, again, because white lost some tempies with rook e1, bishop f1. Also, don't forget about bishop b5 check, so lost a couple of tempies, and then this typical structure is already, I wouldn't say harmless, but it's already probably just equal, because rook c1, rook c8, again, typical play here. not so easy to find the plan. Yeah, in this position, I mean, black has usually what black is doing is having his queen on b8, rook e8, bishop f8, sometimes g6, bishop g7, and then always trying to find the correct moment for d5 or b5 push. It's extremely difficult. I played quite a lot this type of position. Extremely difficult for white to improve. And black has always some kind of counterplay. Whatever white is doing, black has his own chances. So just a complicated position. For instance, one of the possible plans maybe to get the rook on d2, rook e8, but still not clear what is white's next. Yeah, in this situation, of course, you need to like this type of positions. You need to know how to play, the typical plans here. But all in all, it's not a bad outcome of the opening for black. Maybe also for white, because anyways, playing bishop b5 check, the main goal for white is to get a playable position with a bit more space. I mean, to have at least some chances for a small plus, and avoiding main Sicilians, which he also manages by playing like this. But in general, as you've seen, to summarize all those lines, and especially bishop b5 check, I don't really think it's very dangerous. It's just that it's quite difficult for white to find any very line against this second d6 if he doesn't want to play main Sicilian. So find a line where he can really seriously fight for an advantage. So probably if you are Najdorf player or Rauser player, I think I would advise you to start with second d6, because the sidelines after d6 are, in my opinion, much less dangerous than after second knight c6, which we are going to consider in the next two lessons. I just can only say that after e4 c5, knight f3, knight c6, actually it's not even clear if d4 is the main move anymore. If after second d6 or second e6, it's pretty obvious that d4 now is the most popular and the main move. After knight c6, white has very serious options instead of third d4. So let's move to e4 c5, knight f3, knight c6, and I will try to show you how to play it with white, and maybe some lines that you can try with black. But definitely, to summarize, knight f3 d6 again, I don't see any problem. You have to be prepared. I think that this was already quite a good survey. I mean, you know quite a lot already playing black after knight f3 d6. I think, well, hopefully you are ready to play it, and you can be sure that you will not get into the problem out of the opening.